Good morning, everyone. I'm talking to you from Toronto, Canada, and my guest this morning is Jennifer Smith from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. We're going to talk to you for a little bit this morning about Jen's new book. It's called Sociolinguistic Variation in Children's Language, and it's coming out in the Cambridge University Press series, Studies in Language Variation and Change. I happen to have the privilege of being the editor of this series. And I want to tell you a little bit about, to start with, about why I even wanted to do the series. Well, as you know, I am a variationist sociolinguist, and I do a lot of work in the area of dialects, variation, how languages change over time, and how dialects are great representations of those changes. One of the things I started noticing is that there's a certain time in a scholar's life, usually comes after they've written a series of articles, they've spread their work around in journals like LVC and Language and Society and ELL, those kinds of journals. And they're going strong. But one of the things I noticed is there gets to be a time when you need to synthesize, you need to step back from all the individual articles you're writing and pull it all together. And as soon as I notice a scholar is in that position or getting to the point where they are, that's when I sit down and I have a conversation with them and I say, what do you think? Isn't it time to write a monograph? Isn't it time to bring the research strands together, step back and reflect on how your work contributes to the study of language variation and change? And I believe, Jen, it wasn't that long ago where we had a conversation just like that. And I suggested that you write this book on the work you were doing in Bucky with children. Can you talk to us about why you were motivated to do this kind of work?
Yeah, sure. I think when you look at the body of work in sociolinguistics, we've now been going for maybe 60 years, maybe a little bit over. And in those 60 years, we've learned a lot about variation and change in adult and adolescent speech. We know a lot in not only in English and many other languages as well, and the varieties within those. But what we know much, much less about is what happens in the years preceding adolescence and adulthood. And if you think of it, that's quite strange in a way, because if you're trying to understand what people are doing as adults or adolescents, it's quite hard to be able to do that without knowing where they started off from. It's this whole it's like they're floating in the air with nothing underneath them. What were those roots underneath them? And how might those roots impact on how they sound now? So if you look again across the body of work, you'll find that it's really, really a tiny, tiny percentage of research is done on kids before adolescence or before pre-adolescence. And
Yeah.
certainly if you go further back to preschool kids, when they first start acquiring language itself, there's even less done on that. I don't know the numbers on it, but I would suspect 0.1% or something like that. So in a way, we have this whole, because we like to talk in numbers, right? So we have this whole missing piece of the puzzle of variation. And I think as well, if you go back again a few decades, we kind of had the idea that sociolinguistic norms was something that you got in pre-adolescence and adolescence and into adulthood. But now, the more that we're finding out, it looks like you're getting those things in whatever form we mean by getting much, much earlier. So again, it was this missing piece of the pie that we had that really motivated me to go and look further at these preschool kids. So the book focuses on, the children are generally around 3 to 4 years old. I think it's 2 years, 10 months old. up to 4 years old. So getting them in the home with their caregivers, in interaction with their caregivers at that very start of the acquisition process. And we know certainly that if you look more broadly at language acquisition, we know absolutely tons about how kids start out with language. You know, these wee linguistic geniuses that go from, 0 to hero in about 2 years. And we know absolutely tons of those in mainstream language, tons about them in mainstream language acquisition research.
Mm-hmm.
But we know really very little about what happens with variation. And again, that's weird, because if we want to know about how kids acquire, if we want to know about how kids acquire language, part and parcel of that has got to be how they acquire variation as well. Because we know this isn't a little niche thing that, kids do in Northeast Scotland. We know that kids worldwide absolutely vary in their everyday speech. And the other thing we know as well is this idea that they come along to the sociolinguistic forms later in life. We can see when we're out in the streets walking around that that's not true, because we can see that a 3-year-old kid from Newcastle sounds Geordie. A 4-year-old kid from Dublin sounds like they're from Dublin. So already they're beginning to establish all these variable forms that are in their particular dialect. So myself and Mercedes wanted to look more closely at that.
Fascinating to hear your motivations, but the question that arises, and I'm sure many people will wonder, how on earth did you get that kind of data?
Well, once you try trying to get the data, you realize why not many people have done it. It ain't easy. So, and part of this process, I was like dreaming of the day when I could just go in and talk to an elderly person in their house about past times in school. I was so dreaming of that, because compared to getting data from kids, that's a walk in the park, really. We think at the time that's quite difficult to get. Getting data from kids, it's really, it's a walk in the park. It's quite difficult. But luckily, I had a community member. Well, I should start, first of all, full disclosure. I am from the research site I worked in, okay, Bucky in Northeast Scotland. So already you immediately have an in. Yes, I'm wearing my special ring today that is BCK, short for Bucky, especially for this recording. So I already have an in because I'm a community insider. But of course, I haven't lived in that community for, well, now over 30 years. Well, I left to go to university when I was 18, but all of my family still come from here.
Mm.
And luckily, my mum was the type of person that everyone in the community knew, and everyone loved my mum.
The
So
quintessential community member to target for
absolutely,
help in the
total gold.
community. Excellent.
Absolutely, complete gold. So she was able. We're having a cat joining us now. Hello, this is Gracie. So she was absolute gold, because me going in and asking people that I didn't necessarily know any longer, that's a tough thing. And equally, what I'm asking to do is, I wasn't asking to go in and talk to them for an hour. That wouldn't work with young kids. What I was asking the caregivers to do, I haven't talked about the caregivers yet, but it was crucial for the research questions that Mercedes and I were asking. It was crucial that we had caregiver data as well, and I can come back to that if you'd like. So we weren't asking, can we come to your house for an hour and talk about olden times? We were really asking them to do something much more. And what we were asking them to do is record themselves, the caregivers, and their child in daily interaction. And we were asking them to do that for 10 hours. Quite a big ask to ask, I'm going to, I'm going to impose myself on you for the next week while you do these recordings. And that was partly because we needed it to be like that, because if I'd gone in as someone that the kids didn't know, and I asked them, to talk about, have you ever been in danger of death? That's not going to work. That is absolutely not going to work in getting the data from the kids. Do you also have a cat there? Cat attention. So we were asking them just to record themselves in any sort of situation whether that's, having their dinner or getting dressed or playing or teaching, a range of situations. So luckily, I had my mum basically ask people, and because people know my mum and she has likely done them many favors in the past too, we had almost 100% agreement to take on this really very, quite onerous task. And we had, I think, we ended up with 29 caregiver child pairs. I think we asked about 31 or 32. So most of them said yes, absolutely amazing. So in terms of getting the actual data, we hooked the caregiver and the child. All caregivers were mothers, by the way. We hooked them up with little clip-on microphones, you can see how technology moves on. It was little MP3 players they were recorded on. Hey, remember those? Not quite reel to reel, but the equivalent of. And we asked them, just record yourself. So we got a bunch of great data from that, and wow, thanks to the caregivers and kids for agreeing to do that.
It's really quite remarkable that you were able to do that. So now the next question I have is, like, what kinds of questions did you pose with the material? Because it's almost easy to say, okay, I'm going to go do X, there's the data, but then you come back to the lab, and then what questions do you ask of the data?
Yeah, and so we had done, before we did the book, we had, of course, some questions before that had arisen. And then, of course, those questions are organic. Once you start finding out more things, you have more questions to ask. So we had a number of key questions that we wanted to focus in, and we did focus in on the book. So one of them was, how do caregivers talk to their kids? So we know a lot about that in what I'm calling mainstream acquisition research. We know that caregivers are said to talk slowly, with more radical intonation patterns. They use diminutives, doggy, dolly, etc., repetition. We know quite a lot about the adjustments that caregivers make in their speech to kids. But what we don't know really, or what we don't know much about, is how caregivers adjust, and I'm putting that in inverted commas, adjust their speech to kids with respect to dialect forms. Particularly the case if a dialect form is stigmatized, right? So, you'll have heard me already in this 10 minutes. I am full of glottal stops, okay? There's hardly a T in my speech. So what do caregivers do? But I'm full of them. In fact, the whole of the UK, talk about COVID spreading. Wow, glottals have spread very, very fast, very, very rapidly, and throughout the whole of the UK. But on the other side of that, highly stigmatized still, right?
Yeah.
And caregivers, I remember my mom telling me off when I was young, don't say butter, say butter. So what do caregivers do with those non-standard forms? How do they manipulate and adapt those in their speech to kids? And how is that different to what they do in adult to adult speech? So you almost had a triangulation of community speech, caregiver speech, and then I'll get to the kids' speech as well. So how do caregivers talk to their kids? Do they talk in dialect? Do they talk in standard? And spoiler alert, they do both.
Guess you'll have to read the book to find out exactly. Now, I have another question, and that is, as you were producing all these different papers and asking, one question at a time, what was different about writing a book where you were asked to pull it all together into a synthesis?
Yeah, because I think we're so used as academics, we it's certainly in linguistics, we write papers
Mm,
and we think in that 8,000 word type format.
mm-hmm.
Um, and then, of course, in a book, what you have to avoid doing is just making that bigger. That's not what you want to do in a book. You want to be able to
Exactly.
do
Yeah,
different
yeah.
things, right?
Yes.
So part of that for us was having, for myself and Mercedes, was having the space to really get back to the data and put in lots and lots of examples of the data to exemplify the kinds of things we were saying. And in a journal article, you really don't have the space to do that at all. So it's very much, we have tons of narratives from the kids or comedy acts from the kids and caregivers and interaction. So that was a massive, massive bonus for us. But then how do you use that in, a worthwhile way? So we could have just written a whole book of hilarious stories from the kids, right? Hilarious interactions, but that's not the point. How does this highlight what you want to show? And those kind of, I think, the liveliness of it, you can do much more of that in a book. And I see that in your books as well, Sally. You're able to do those things that the dryness of an article in a way, because it has to be dry because there's only 8,000 words there. You're able to expand on those issues.
I think it's enables you to bring the humanity back into the analysis so that your science is not just scientific and anonymous and dry. It actually brings the human beings into the picture. And I think your book is spectacular for being able to have the stories from the community. The stories from the kids are absolutely amazing and hilarious and funny, and yet pulled together with these very important, groundbreaking results from the research. And I think that's what makes this book so successful. Now, here's another type of question, Jen. It is not easy to write a book. And it's not easy to write a book, the kind of book that I'm asking my authors to write. And that is, don't just string together a bunch of articles. Step back from it, synthesize, figure out what the bigger picture is. So tell us a little bit about that. Was it harder to write a book than to write a series of articles?
1,000%, or X factor, 110%, as they would say. Oh my goodness, yes. And I think, so you, Sally, I very much get the impression you quite enjoy the process of writing books. It suits you in a way to write the books. Would that be right? Or
Well, thank you for saying so. Maybe it's true. I haven't written one recently. Woe is me. But I think there's a certain satisfaction that comes from stepping back, realizing what you've done, and realizing what it's taught you.
Mhm. Definitely, yeah, definitely. And can you tell that I'm dodging this question? Which was a different, I turned it back to you. So for me, I found it, probably because it's the first book I've written as well, hopefully the last. I found it quite a difficult process.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, and
Fair.
I think if you're thinking about writing a book, I think knowing the format you're good at writing, and I realize that in actual fact, even though I really, you're dead right about the humanity and how that can come out in a book that gets kind of lost in an 8,000
Mhm.
word article, but I realize that actually my style suits writing quite minimally, quite briefly, And so I had to really always fight against that, because otherwise the book would have been like a pamphlet and not a book. So I think if you're thinking about, will I now go and write this book, or does it suit you? Is it within your style to do that? All comes back.
And yet, as you dodge this question and tell me how terrible and how you didn't like it, this is a fantastic book. I mean, I think if you look back and you go read the book, go flip through it, you'll say, "Wow, I'm glad I did that." And
Oh, I think most definitely. And you're so right, Sally, to have something in that format that puts it all in one place. I think
yeah.
that's a very important thing to do, for sure. Absolutely.
So reflecting back now, it's been how many months since we put the book out, and we selected the incredible front cover of the book. It's beautiful, very telling, has a message to it. So the book is there. It's on the shelf. It's on the desk. It's in the world. So now that you've had a chance to sit back and reflect, is there anything you see now that you would have done differently or think of differently? And what do you see in the data now that's propelling you forward?
Yeah, that's of course, because if we're in it and writing the book, we have zero perspective.
I
Right?
know.
And there are deadlines, and you have to you have to meet those deadlines, especially if the series editor is Sali Tagliamonte. You have to meet those deadlines. She is good at deadlines. I'm not good at deadlines. So, and then of course, as with any piece of research, whether it's in an article format or a book format, the the more time goes on, the more things we learn. And of
Mhm,
course, you look back and think, actually, now, not necessarily I would have done that differently, but I think more I can see now in parts of the data that I think we should have interpreted it differently. I'm sorry, Mercedes, I'm saying we, maybe Mercedes disagrees with this, we would have interpreted it differently. And I've got a very good reason for saying that, because the kids that we recorded for the book, the 3 and 4 year old kids, the preschoolers as we call them, we were in a very lucky position in that we were able to go back and re-record those kids in pre-adolescence. So we went back, it was about 7 or 8 years later, and recorded a subset, about half of those kids again. There are 14 kids in the real-time follow-up study. And of course, the more you know, the more you learn. And this is an
mhm,
absolute classic case of this. So if I talk more, that's a bit abstract, I'll talk concretely now. In our day, when we were looking at the data, I think what we do as sociolinguists is we look for the patterns, right? Well, once
mhm.
we've got past that absolutely terribly ugly graph we've just produced that doesn't seem to show anything, and then we start finding the patterns. And Mercedes and I talked a lot in the book about the patterns in the kid data and the community norms that they seem to be acquiring pretty early on. I mean, there were caveats in those, it depended on the linguistic variable, etc. But
Mhm,
we found those patterns of use. But now we've started, myself and Sophie Holmes Elliott have started analysing the pre-adolescent data, the real-time data from those 14 kids we recorded again. And what we're seeing is something super duper interesting in what happens in those years from preschool to pre-adolescence. And what is put, very simply put, we've only looked at a few variables so far, 2 or 3 variables. We need a much bigger body of linguistic variables. But what we're finding is that if you think of it in a graph, if you think of those preschool kids and you look at both rates and constraints of use, we found in those data they were quite spread out. So what I mean by that is Liam might have had, 15% glottal replacement, and Ellie might have had 95% glottal replacement, the rates. And then in the constraints, Ellie might have had 82% glottal replacement in intervocalic position, and Liam might have had, 43%. So there was quite some differences going on there. But what we found with the pre-adolescent kids is an absolute focusing of norms in those intervening years between preschool and pre-adolescence. So then again, if you think of the graph and the young kids, the preschool kids are kind of spread out here, there, and everywhere. And then the pre-adolescents are all up in one corner, clustered, clustered, clustered. So it's exactly like Trudgill's idea of focusing that goes on. And we see that focusing. And again, this goes back to the opening point about why look at young kids, etc. And I think here, what we see is in all that action that goes on, Labov talks a lot about transmission and incrementation, pinpointing that action and being able to see exactly what goes on then in pre-adolescence. But what goes on in pre-adolescence can only, of course, be understood if you have the preschool data as well to compare, right? You might think those pre-adolescents were always super focused and always looked like that. No, there was a process they went through in that upward slope of incrementation that Labov talks about. So in terms of, I'm absolutely not saying that what we did in the book was wrong. No, absolutely not. Because of course there were patterns of use there, but it's a really brilliant example of the more you know. Is it the more you learn, the more you know? I don't know which way it goes. The more you know, the more you learn. Probably it goes both ways. So we're really excited now to delve more into the pre-adolescent data and see what that can tell us about that place in the linguistic lifespan that we don't know much about, and yet we know the action happens there. Once you get to adulthood, people have stabilized, right? They're kind of, we know what they're going to do then. They stabilize. And there's all this action and movement going on earlier on. And that's really what we're very excited about now.
Well, that's pretty awesome. I think I'll have to have another conversation with you. Meantime, I want to come back to, you mentioned how difficult it is to write a book, and I don't want to scare people off. Can you talk a little bit about, part of what I do as the editor of this series is I help people along with their books. And I spend a lot of time, I invest a lot of time in reading drafts and reading chapters and making suggestions and talking people through it. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And you were a brilliant editor in that way. It wasn't folks just nagging. It was absolutely.
I paid her to say that. No?
And we could go to Sali at any point and say, we're struggling with this bit. We're not sure which way to go here. And Sali would get right back to you and offer some suggestions for that. Always on the end of, I was going to say on the end of a Zoom call, but that wasn't true then. Always on the end of an email or a Skype, in fact. There's a blast from the past. Yes. So very much helped in the process. And I don't know if you remember, Sali, but when we'd handed you over a near final draft, we happened to be at a conference in Malaga in Spain. Do you remember? Was it Malaga?
Right.
It was Malaga. So we were sitting on a rooftop bar and I was slurping a pina colada or some such cocktail while Sali sat there with her iPad and her program, that the software, the app that allows a markup on your paper. And I sat there like... sucking on my pina colada as she swished and swished, and the marker came out over and over and over. And I was like, stop doing that. Let's just drink cocktails. She's
Pina
like, no, I
coladas.
want to do it now. So that is the kind of hands-on help you will get from Sally. So I was handed over at the end of that rooftop bar session with this highly marked up um, um, draft of the book, full of absolutely excellent comments that we were able to integrate. It really tightened up the whole thing. So thank you.
Well, I don't want to scare people off. I do want to encourage people to think about if they are at that point where they're starting to think about a bigger piece of work and a more programmatic approach to their research, what would you advise prospective authors?
In terms of,
Your advice, what would you do? What do you, when do you know you're ready? Uh, Not that Sally Tagliamonte comes knocking on your door or sits you down for a cup of coffee or pina colada, but any advice you might give to somebody who's thinking they might be getting close to wanting to write a book?
yeah, I would say I suppose you kind of know yourself often, well, I have this body of work now. It would be great to have that in one place. Um, so you can, but often for me, I don't think I would have gone ahead and contacted another to do that. I needed the nudge from you in a way, Sally. So I would suggest to people contact Sally or another to talk about it, right? You know, a series editor can only say no, right? So it's not a bad thing to ask for sure. And you kind of, as I said, you kind of know yourself if you have enough in a way, if you're at that point where you want to put it all together.
Yeah, so true. So, as we continue to do more and more research in language variation and change, and as Jen laid out for us earlier, there are so many points in time along the lifespan that it's still a mystery. We have many uncharted territories. So, there are many places to go in the study of language variation and change. So, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation this morning with our cats and our uh, lack of pina coladas. Maybe it's time to have one of those again, Jen. So thanks for listening, and I hope that you will find the Studies in Language Variation Change series attractive. At the very least, I would suggest, if you're interested in anything we've talked about here, to get a hold of Jennifer's book. It's called Sociolinguistic Variation in Children's Language, and it's written by Jennifer Smith and Mercedes Durham. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.